Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and it's great to see everyone. I'm very happy to be back here virtually as it is at the Theosophical Society in England. I'll just share my screen with you as I do have a presentation, a PPT presentation for you tonight. Can everyone see my screen okay? Wonderful. All right, yes, and the topic of today's talk might be somewhat unusual from a theosophical perspective. It's not often that genealogy is spoken of in theosophical lectures or lodge meetings. And so I intentionally chose something a little bit different because I wanted to explore the way in which theosophy, being comprised of universal truths, is relevant in all areas of inquiry. Throughout my life, I've had many different interests, and something that I found is that theosophy is a kind of connector between these different interests. For example, before I even knew that theosophy existed, I was fascinated by history, by science, by technology, by futurism, by philosophy. And I found that these different subjects end up becoming quite niche. They end up having their own kind of specializations. They tend to interact in a very limited basis with other specializations. And what you get is this very narrow perspective into these fascinating areas of life. And what I love about theosophy is the fact that theosophy attempts to connect all of these different areas of inquiry. And the way this was stated in the three objects of the Theosophical Society was the comparative study of religion, philosophy, and science. And so this was a really revolutionary idea at the time. This was at a period where, in particular, religion and science were seemed to be at odds, and philosophy was somewhere confusingly in the middle of this crazy conflict that was taking place between the two. And what was so beautiful about theosophy being presented to the world as it was in the late 19th century was that it was presented at a time when this conflict was really at its height. And what I found by exploring these different areas of inquiry is that theosophy can actually be applied to anything. Because when you think about it, if theosophy is comprised of universal truths, these universal truths must be true no matter where they are applied. So they can be applied to all aspects of society. And to use an interesting example, Annie Besant, the former president of the international president of the Theosophical Society, applied this to social justice and applied this to human rights and applied this to issues in politics at the time. So that's a really interesting example of how this can actually be applied in any area and still be relevant. It needn't be something which is purely philosophical, purely a theory. And also, theosophy should not be regarded as a subject. It's not a subject distinct from other subjects. It's in fact a basis of, or a worldview which can be applied to all subjects and which should be at the foundation of all of them. So I've always had this deep interest in genealogy even before I became a member of the Theosophical Society. So I thought it might be a challenge, but also a really interesting sort of avenue to explore, to look at genealogy through the insights provided by theosophy. So with that, I'd like to give just, before we continue on in the PPT presentation, I'd like to give just a very brief overview of how I came to be interested in genealogy and how I came to be interested in theosophy and how my curiosity sort of converges between the two. So I've always been curious and fascinated by how things came to exist. So we arrive here in this world, we're born in this world, we sort of have to accept things as they are. But I've always been really curious about the past. And obviously this curiosity led me to history, where I found that rather than providing simple answers, exploring the past provides countless new doorways, leading to further and even more complex mysteries that need to be answered. So the past, I think there's a misconception where the past is seen to be something which is done and dealt with. We know the past, we've studied that, we've been there, we've done that. And I think that's absolutely wrong. I think the further you go into the past, the more you explore different aspects of the past, the more you discover that how little we know about our origins. And I think that's beautiful, that mystery of life, that mystery of our origins. And this quest for curiosity also led me to science, where I found consistent and universal principles which could be applied to understanding the events of our world, both past, present, and future. Likewise, I delved into the philosophies and worldviews of the world's myriad religions, finding symbolic and mythological explanations for the big questions of life. Long afternoons of my teenage years were spent perusing the volumes on the shelves of my local library as I worked my way through sections from history to philosophy to religion, and then onto occults. One day I stumbled across a lengthy tome with the cryptic yet alluring title of The Secret Doctrine. It was here that I found a worldview that suited my curiosity, and which conceived of the various roads of inquiry as different facets of a unified whole. My quest for understanding the past likewise led me to be curious about my own origins as an individual. I wanted to know more about where I came from, where my parents came from, and my grandparents, and their parents, and so on. I've always found it to be a fascinating truth that I and every other individual only exist here and now as an individual human being, experiencing life at this particular point in history due to a seemingly endless chain of other individuals who preceded me, each with their own lives, experiences, questions, and curiosities about the world. It is both a humbling and an incredibly expansive realization in which the individual is transcended to become an infinite web of relations, stretching back to the dawn of time. As I explored my family history, I was intrigued by the connections I found. Ancestors from places I never thought my family was at all associated with appeared in my family tree and branched off to further and further destinations. Associations with other family names, both well-known and obscure, led me to the realization that despite the snobbery of centuries of aristocracy, we are all of us descended from kings and farmers, and from saints and sinners alike. It's a humbling realization, and one which likewise relates to the principle of reincarnation. Just as reincarnation teaches that we are not merely this personality that we so often associate ourselves with, that we are much more than this individual that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and is heard no more, that we are connected through karmic links to countless other lifetimes and incarnations, so too does genealogy reveal this link on a more physical level. And what's beautiful about theosophy, again, is that theosophy deals with all aspects of our existence. It deals not only with the spiritual, not only with the mental, but it also does deal with the physical. And I find that we, in our theosophical lodges, in many meetings I've attended and many lectures I've given before, the focus is often on the spiritual. And that makes sense because the reason why we come here to theosophy is generally for spiritual reasons. But I think it's really interesting to take spiritual principles and to apply them to something which is very physical. And obviously, genealogy is something which is intrinsically physical. It's about our lineage, our parents and grandparents going back. So it's a rather physical exploration. But I think that you can take these spiritual principles, you can apply them to something physical, and you end up finding truths which apply both on a physical and a spiritual level on all levels of our existence. And that's what's really beautiful about this idea of the Hermetic Axiom. So the Hermetic Axiom, as above, so below, states that what applies to one aspect of our existence, such as the spiritual, must also apply or be reflected on every other level, such as the physical. To return to what we said in the introduction of today's talk, the idea that these principles being universal must apply equally on all levels. So for it to be a principle which applies spiritually, it must also be a principle which applies physically and mentally and in all other levels of our existence. So it's a little test, if you like, when you take a spiritual principle and you apply it on the physical level, or when you take a principle conceived of as being universal on the physical level, and then you apply that to the spiritual realm, it should also equally apply if it is something which is truly universal. So it's interesting, therefore, to see the principle of our spiritual interconnectedness, as we learn from the principles of karma and reincarnation, further reflected in our physical interconnectedness as the human race, and further as life in general upon the earth. All life is one. This fundamental truth lies at the heart of the theosophical worldview. Theosophy points like a ray of light towards that font of unity that lies hidden beyond the tangled differences of external forms, postulating a unified universe, a cosmic harmony which is fundamentally orderly and purposeful, a relation and unity of all life, through which the scheme of evolution, both spiritual and material, takes place. And a bit later on in today's talk, we are going to look at how genealogy and the tracing of one's family history is also related to evolution, the former being an aspect of the latter. In our theosophical lodges and study groups, we learn about karma, or the spiritual principle of cause and effect. In essence, the law of karma asserts that every situation, from the microcosmic to the macrocosmic, has a preceding cause, and that this chain of cause and effect continues back to the causeless cause, or in theosophy and in Hindu philosophy, known as Parabrahm. Genealogy, like karma, consists of the tracing of links from cause to effect, and so on back to our primal origins in the distant evolutionary past. We are, in fact, the effects of our forebears, and by understanding where we came from, we will be better prepared to face the present and the uncertain future ahead. Likewise, as we know from the law of karma, every effect is in turn a cause, and as such, as the cause of the future, as such, we are the cause of the future, of our children and the generations to come. Genealogy therefore reveals to us a great responsibility, not only for our present situation, for the future itself. So while genealogy is often conceived as being the study of the past, the study of these dusty old tomes of family history, I actually find there's a lot of inspiration there for the present and a lot to learn in terms of how we address the future. We can learn from the mistakes of the past. We can learn from both the successes and the mistakes of our ancestors. And we can recognize that that is what makes us who we are today. And we can take that knowledge with all its good and with all its bad, and we can do something wonderful and something practical with that. And that makes me hopeful and inspired and really excited when looking towards the future, because the future is a blank slate and we can We can write on it what we like. And so a lot of people ask what genealogy actually is. How can you define genealogy? And so I quite like the following sort of interpretation of genealogy. Genealogy is, in essence, the study of evolution through the tracing of pedigrees from one generation to the next. As such, it is the study of interconnectedness. In particular, it traces lines of descent from one particular to a broader ancestral tree. The study of genealogy reveals the rich diversity of the world we inhabit, with its many cultures, ethnicities, civilizations, and families. The tapestry of life is interwoven with many forms, from the human to the animal to the vegetable and mineral, all fundamentally connected and related in unexpected and fascinating ways. Despite the seeming unrelatedness of such vastly different life forms as the elephant and the dandelion, modern science reveals to us the truth of unity, which remains ever existent beneath the surface, a single thread running throughout the variety of forms. And this is something which I think theosophy has always understood. And if we look at the ancient philosophy, the ancient philosophers, the ancient teachings of different religions, usually found at the core of these religious ideas, we find this truth of unity, the idea that there is something which connects us all, something which binds us all, which seems to go against our common sense. We seem to see ourselves as very different, very distinct from all else. And so it can take some time to adjust to this idea that actually there is an interconnectedness, but it's not something we need to take on someone's word or take as a religious truth. It's something we can find in evidence. It's something which science itself reveals to us through experiment, through exploration of our DNA, and through our interconnectedness with all these other forms of life. We are not so different from the other forms of life we see around us. And if we're not so different, say, from a tiger or from a tree, then obviously, how can we be at all different from the other humans around us? And that's where this gets really interesting, because that's where we start to see just how silly discrimination and racism and prejudice and all these terrible things which are far too common in our world right now. That's where we start to see how silly all of those things really are. So how does genealogy demonstrate our fundamental interconnectedness with all life? Essentially, it's a matter of mathematics. Let's start with a little arithmetic. To use an average, let's imagine that each of the ancestors on your family tree had 2.5 children. It's not possible, but we'll do it for the purpose of an average. In this situation, you would have about 8 first cousins. This might not sound like much, but when you bring second, third, fourth cousins and so on into the picture, this number starts to expand exponentially. In fact, you would have over 110,000 seventh cousins. Now, imagine if your ancestors averaged 4 children instead. You would now have over 6 million seventh cousins. So you can see one fascinating aspect of family history and genealogy is that these small numbers very quickly expand into extremely large numbers. And that's where we start to see this idea of interconnectedness coming into play. So it is, in fact, an ever extending or ever expanding tree. Simply put, as we extend further back in our family histories, the chances of your family tree overlapping with another person's increases. While we are all obviously distantly connected through our common human origins in the very distant past, we are also linked much more closely than generally realized through the exponential growth of human populations over the past few centuries. And if we consider what's happened over the past few centuries, it's been a process of globalization as communities have become more international, as trade has really developed through technology, for the internet, for the ease of travel. Obviously, this interconnectedness has just been increasing and spreading. So while this interconnectedness has always been there at the root of life, we all come from the same origins. In recent years, this increased community that we live in, this global community we find ourselves to be a part of, has increased the chances of a more recent interconnectedness with life, with other life. This can be demonstrated with some more mathematics, but nothing too complicated. The number of branches or ancestors on your family tree doubles with each preceding generation. Looking at the family tree, we can see that from two parents, we have 4 grandparents, and from them we have 8 great-grandparents and 16 great-great-grandparents, and so on and on and on. Following on from this, extending back 400 years or so, you will find that you have over 100,000 ancestors. When you apply the statistic to the city that your family is from, the chances that a stranger you are seated beside on the bus or who is standing in the queue ahead of you at the supermarket is actually your distant cousin is very high. So this very idea of people being strangers or different or other than you sort of starts to evaporate when you study genealogy, and suddenly everyone is your very distant cousin, which is quite fascinating. And I've through my own search into my family history, I've made contacts with people from all around the world who are quite literally my distant cousins, but who I would never know are related to me at all if I had not explored my family history. And so there are 2 mathematical forces at work here. As we journey further and further back in time, we have exponentially more and more ancestors. And this may seem like common sense when exploring or when considering a small city or town in the UK, but you may be wondering if the same principle applies when considering a stranger who originates from somewhere as distant as Shanghai or Tokyo or another part of the world. The answer is simply yes. However, rather than going back 400 years to find that common ancestor, you may need to go back rather further. Regardless of how far back you may need to go, and this is often something which cannot be traced through generational links on a family tree, genetics confirms that these connections exist between all ethnicities, cultures, and individuals, regardless of origins. In fact, genetics is proof of these connections. Excuse me. Through genetics, we discover this fascinating and beautiful interconnectedness of the human family. It transforms a mathematical formula to a fundamental reality, from a statistical probability to the identification of real individuals that you have in common with another stranger's family tree. Genetics permits us to transform a theory into ancestry. Studying one's family history reveals a personal narrative, the intergenerational story of you. The axiom that no man is an island holds true from a genealogical perspective also, as we are each of us a product of a vast genealogical history, stretching back to the very dawn of time. It is easy to forget, when faced with the stress and bustle of everyday life, the sacrifices and triumphs, the loves and conflicts of all who preceded us and made us who we are today. And that's another aspect of this research, which I find personally incredibly rewarding. Because most of our ancestors are not people who are particularly famous or well-known or who have made their names in history. But by researching them, we keep their story alive. We discover these individuals whose stories would otherwise not be known. And many of them actually have really fascinating stories to share. And these are stories that no one else is keeping alive. No one else is sharing these stories. No one else is researching these stories. Only we are, as people, as genealogists, people who are researching our ancestry, looking into our origins. We're the only ones who are keeping these people's stories alive. And it's really fascinating to go back and discover the things that they experienced, the history that they lived through, the challenges that they must experience in their life, and also the hopes and dreams that they must have aspired to. And I think it's beautiful to explore not only the famous people in history, but also the countless others whose names have not been recorded in the history books, but who form a fundamental part of our own histories. And it really is a testament to this idea that none of us exist alone. We're all part of this vast network, and we all of us depend on one another in various ways, and that cooperation really is the truth of history rather than purely competition and conflict. There is also a lot of beautiful aspects of our history to be found in what has built the modern world and what has brought us to this moment in time. So I like to think there's a lot of positivity in the study and tracing of our family histories. Look at a few spiritual or religious aspects now of genealogy. Genealogy traces back thousands and thousands of years, and one of the aspects in which genealogy has been kept alive through time is through the veneration of ancestors. This is something which is particularly important in some religions found in the East, but also some religions in Africa, and in fact also in many religions in the West, if we go back to some of the pre-Christian pagan times as well. So in some cultures, the veneration of ancestors remains an important part of how the modern-day individual relates to the past. For example, in Chinese traditional religion, paying homage to one's ancestors is seen as a way in which to honor and recollect the actions of one's forebears. The significance of ancestor veneration in China and the dedication which is applied to genealogical records may be seen in the tracing of over 2 million descendants of the philosopher Confucius, who lived from approximately 551 to 479 BC, whose descendants alive today are in the 83rd generation. Confucius's family tree covers 43,000 pages in 80 volumes, his genealogy having been maintained for over 2,000 years, with hundreds of thousands of his descendants now living outside of China. And I chose this particular example partly because it's perhaps the most complete and oldest family tree to exist in the present time, but also to show just how exponential this diversity is from the origin, in this case Confucius, to the millions of descendants living today in various parts of the world. So it's quite fascinating to see that this from this one origin comes forth a great extent of diversity. Such veneration of ancestors reflects an inherent recognition of the importance of our roots. It is an expression of a spiritual urge to honor and remember that which came before, and to recognize the past as the foundation upon which the present and the future are built. Beyond all theories and dogmas, we, as a human family, have some intrinsic understanding of the process of evolution. And this is reflected in the importance given to genealogy, to lineages and pedigrees, and to one's familial connections throughout history. And yet, as we venture further and further back, and as the branches of one's family tree stretch out to touch those of another, we begin to recognize that everything is related, that all life is fundamentally one. What does this mean to us in terms of our interactions, our relationships, and our perspectives of other people that we might encounter in day-to-day life? Essentially, it confirms that we are one human family, and that the perceived differences of ethnicity, culture, religion, and tribe, and so on, should not be perceived as barriers to our interconnectedness, but rather as beautiful aspects of our diversity, which altogether is rooted in a fundamental unity. It is the failure to recognize our shared roots that all too often gives cause to conflict and discord, whether on the personal level of prejudice and discrimination, or on the terrible international level of invasion and war. It's clear then that from even a basic study of genealogy, that such discriminative attitudes as racism, classism, and all such otherisms must be rooted fundamentally in ignorance, whether willful or not. We can recognize the truth that we all share the same roots, and that we all come from the same place, and further, that we are all travelers along the same road, finding our way through the twists and turns of life. And in this situation, where is the place for such discrimination? How can such attitudes hold up to the force of reason? Perhaps the greatest contribution to the intellectualism of the 18th and 19th centuries to our modern understanding of the world has been the doctrine of evolution. In its physical aspects, the theory of evolution is clearly presented in Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, while a much grander scheme of evolution is presented in Madame Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, in which evolution is considered not only in its physical aspects, as presented through the various root races and the rise and fall of civilizations, but also in its mental and spiritual aspects. Genealogy and evolution are, of course, fundamentally connected, as genealogy is, in fact, one aspect of evolution. Here we see one chart from Theosophical Text, which provides the general sort of evolution of life, or the family tree, if you like, the family tree of life in the Theosophical perspective. And interestingly, while genealogy, through the tracing of pedigrees, usually of noble or royal families, was a long-established practice, widely accepted across cultures around the world, evolution took a much longer time to become a widespread idea. When considered, however, evolution is merely an extension of the fundamental principles of genealogy. Or it could be said that genealogy is merely one small aspect of evolution. And what is so revolutionary about the doctrine of evolution is not the origin of species or even the origin of living things and the genesis of our world, but rather the truth it expresses about the oneness of all life. Like genealogy, which traces back the diversity of the billions of people living together to a common shared ancestor, evolution likewise traces the diversity of forms to their origins and shows how all remain fundamentally connected, even today, upon the grand tree of life. This is certainly the greatest principle of genealogy, evolution, and theosophy alike, that through the endless diversity of our complex and ever-changing world, there exists a fundamental interconnectedness and unity, running like a golden thread that penetrates through all the seeming differences and distinctions. It logically follows that anything that affects other people or even other forms of life likewise affects us, because fundamentally, we are them and they are us. In the lower life forms, we see ourselves in simpler and more primitive form. We see the human being from the standpoint of the whole living world, as superior beings in another planet might look upon us. And as a result, we have ceased to a large extent to regard the universe as existing merely for us. In this intellectual and spiritual revolution, we have ceased to occupy a position of solitary grandeur in a little human universe. But we have not grown less. Nature has become so much greater that man's relative perspective in nature has changed. The theosophical mindset is one which embraces an expansion of the mind from the narrow lanes of one's self-identification with creed, nationality, and other particulars, to the broad expanse of wisdom to be found across the breadth of human experience. Genealogy, likewise, provides us with the opportunity to move beyond the limitations of self and to delve into the experiences and histories of those who came before us. Perhaps at the heart of ancestor veneration is the truth that we can learn much from our forebears, both positive and negative, for it was they who built the world we now inhabit. In considering their positive contributions, we are able to adopt those in our own characters and attitudes. We are able to build upon the foundations they set and to use methods which have been tried and tested in times before. In considering the negative, we are able to learn from their mistakes and avoid the same pitfalls in our short time upon this earth. We are able to recognize what is wrong with the world and to seek to address it, without necessarily casting judgment on those who lived in times much different than our own. Exploring the past can oftentimes be a challenge for the modern thinker. There is a tendency to apply one's modern perspectives and moral codes to times when people saw the world very differently from how we see it today. It is easy to be critical of the actions and choices of ancestors who lived in a world we could not possibly truly understand. And yet we may feel reassured when we discover unexpected commonalities. And these may often be found in those universal principles and qualities valued since the dawn of time. Love, compassion, loyalty, truthfulness, cooperation, justice. It is easy to forget, when considering the terrible injustices of the past, that beyond the many tragic and sad instances of history, we find the story of the human race, which has striven to build a better world, and which we, as its inheritors, now have the duty to guard and to improve. Our ancestors therefore pass on to us a great responsibility. We are not the owners of this earth we inhabit, but rather the custodians, whose sacred duty is to protect and heal our world, rather than to solely use it for our own benefits. It is a noble ideal that we should leave this world in a better shape than to that in which it was left to us. On the other hand, exploring genealogy also reveals much about the root of conflict. All human conflict originates in the illusion of the other. In psychology, the term othering refers to the reductive action of labeling and defining a person as someone who belongs to the socially subordinate category of the other. The practice of othering excludes those who do not fit the norm of the social group from participation in such, displacing them, whether physically or socially, from the social group to the margins of society, where mainstream social norms and protections do not apply to them for being the other. History is sadly rife with such examples of othering, from the crimes of colonialism to the horrors of the Holocaust. The brutality of our tribal past remains as a parasite in the structures of our society, and the gospel of us against them is preached in every sector, from political to religious. An understanding of what genealogy teaches us about our interconnectedness sheds light on the following quote from the philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti. The enemy is not the other. The enemy is you. This might sound like a paradox, but it's a paradox which I find reflecting upon sheds much light on it. This is the way of philosophy. I think that philosophy is full of fascinating paradoxes, seeming paradoxes, which when explored cease to be paradoxes, in fact. When we recognize our relation to all life, including to those that we may consider our enemies, we arrive at the realization that it is not their perceived differences which are the issue, but rather our own perspectives and prejudices. We must recognize the artificiality of the division between ourselves and the world, which is in truth a unity, and a unity must be devoid of separateness. When we perceive the world as a unity, inclusive of all life in its diversity of forms, of ourselves and of all others, we may recognize the importance of right thought and right action. It is one thing to look at the world or at society or at the institutions we have set up to manage society, and to say that there is something wrong, a problem which must be addressed. But we must do more than that. The recognition of our fundamental unity is a recognition of the Hermetic Axia, as above, so below, as within, so without. It is a recognition that to change the world, we must first change ourselves. In conclusion, it is the tendency of the human intellect to report that life, in its many forms, is characterized by variety and separation, that there can be no unity amidst such diversity, and that such a concept would be opposed to the facts of nature. Yet from a study of both theosophy and genealogy, we may arrive at the knowledge of an underlying oneness that, in spite of the appearance of duality and diversity, affirms the deeper truth of our connection to one another and to all of life. As such, we become aware of the illusion of separateness, the working fiction of the universe, which veils the fact of unity at the heart of our existence. The past is a foundation already set in stone, established by the countless generations of those who came before. The future is an endless mystery waiting to be written. That task falls to us. That concludes my talk. Thank you very much.